If you had told me the story of how my daughter's birth would go when I was pregnant, I probably would not have believed you. I have one daughter who's 9 months old, so I went through this last year, and from everything I heard when I was pregnant, obviously you plan as much as you can to give birth. You have your birth plan, you have things ready, but you cannot predict exactly how it will go. Nature takes its course. So I always thought that I would plan as much as I could, but not be upset when things didn't go the way that I wanted to. But I'm here to say that sometimes things really do go the way that you want it to, and that's what happened in my birth. So I'm going to tell you all of the planning that I did do and the decisions that I made beforehand and the circumstances that led to such a positive outcome. I knew from the beginning that I wanted to try to have a natural birth. Everybody's different, no judgment. For me, the idea of taking something or taking an epidural was more frightening to me than just going through the experience. I didn't want to feel numb from, the waist down. I didn't want a needle in my back. I really do not like needles. So for me, from very early on, an epidural was not in the equation. Then from there, I started learning about the other things. Like I started learning about how Pitocin is very common to be given to you in a hospital, especially for first-time moms. And I started learning more about labor, and I thought I would like my body to do as much as it can and not be induced, not have Pitocin to speed it along, because I trust that the timing is going to happen the way that it should unfold. And I heard that induction can be more painful. If your body's not completely ready, it makes sense to me. There's a certain timing that I don't want to disturb. I want to go with. I want to feel like I'm working with my baby. We're working together to make this happen. So knowing that I wanted to take this more holistic approach, I did consider looking into birthing centers. And I did think briefly about home births. One of my sisters had 2 home births, but I had a few reservations about home births. My sister and my brother-in-law, who she's married to, are in the medical profession. We live in an apartment. I feel that there wouldn't quite be a room where I would feel fully comfortable or like the room was clean enough. The more that I thought about home birth and imagined it happening, the more I thought, no, I think I'd like to be either at a birth center or a hospital. So I started thinking about birthing centers, and there are some good options in my area. But my insurance policy was kind of vague on birthing centers, and I didn't want to get caught in a technicality and be fighting with insurance after she was born. And so I thought, let me put a pin in that and let me look into the hospital that my gynecologist's office is actually attached to and see what their maternity ward is like, see what their policies are like, and see if I like it. So yes, I had a gynecologist, first of all, and she is in a practice with like 9 other doctors or something. So throughout my pregnancy, me and my husband were hoping that it would be her delivering the baby, because it's just luck of the draw which doctor is on shift that day. But anyway, so I had this gynecologist, and it's about 10-15 minute drive from my house. It's in a good direction for traffic. I live in Los Angeles, so no matter what time of the day I went into labor, I felt like I wouldn't get stuck behind an accident or something. We could take local streets to get there, so that was a factor. As I had these gynecologist appointments, I started asking her more questions each visit on the way that they deliver at that hospital and what it's like. Probably what became the most important thing to me through my pregnancy, based on my research, was that I didn't want to be forced to give birth laying on my back. I didn't want doctors in there pressuring me to be only in that position, because from what I looked into, despite it being the most common position to give birth in, it is probably the worst position you can be in, and you're more likely to tear. Your back being against the bed does not have the freedom that it needs to move. So from what I saw, it's actually like if you can actually be on your side, your back has freedom to move and you're less likely to tear. Another position that helps for that is being on all fours. So I asked my favorite gynecologist from that practice, and she said, we can't force you to do anything. She knows that doctors prefer you to be on your back because that is the position where they have been trained the most to deliver in. But she said, we can't force you to do anything. Now, I can't promise that the charge nurse or whoever's there won't pressure you to be in that position. She goes, I'm just going to be honest with you. But if you are ready, you know that battle's coming. Again, we can't force you to do anything. So I thought that answer was sufficient because I really felt like I was ready to stick to my guns when I get into that situation. So, Luis and I were prepared to go in fighting that battle. Another thing we asked about is, how quick is the hospital to go into a C-section? How quick are they to give you Pitocin? And she was honest about how common both of those things can be at the hospital, but her advice on that was labor at home as much as you can before you go to the hospital. And that's not to say that the baby should be crowning before you go to the hospital, but basically before you get to the point where your contractions are like 5 or 4 minutes apart, there's no reason for you to be at the hospital. And so I really took that to heart, and I fully agreed with her. And that's one of the reasons that pushed me into looking into a doula. So as I progressed in my pregnancy, the plan of having a doula, but also going to the hospital, started to take shape. So then at my next gynecologist appointment, it was, are doulas common in this hospital? And what's that like, the doula being there? Do you have any experience with that, with a doula being present that you could share? And she said, we have had it at this hospital, but it's not that common. Having said that, she definitely saw it as a positive thing, a doula being there, somebody to help advocate for you more, somebody who knows what your birth plan is, who can support you. We knew that Luis was going to be there, but he would be going through this experience for the first time as well. So having somebody there who is experienced, who's like an advocate for you, she was all for it. So from there, I started looking into doulas, and I got some recommendations, just word of mouth pretty much. I started reaching out to women I knew in the area who had given birth, even if it was just an acquaintance. I would see like on their Instagram that they had a doula, or a friend of a friend. I would talk to friends, and from there I got a recommendation. And the doula that I ended up going with, she was actually like a recommendation of a recommendation, because the first recommendation was booked out. So I met with a couple doulas, and I really felt like I connected with the doula that I went with. We had a nice walk. I felt what was most important about choosing a doula was that we like connected. Our personalities, I felt like, connected. We were on the same page. All the questions that I had for her, I really liked her answers. I really liked her point of view. And so that's who I went with. Now, in the contract that I signed with our doula, she had 3 home visits before you give birth, where she comes to our home and we talk about everything. Basically, we prepare. She had recommendations on reading, on positions. We went through some positions that are helpful in labor, all sorts of things like that throughout the 3 visits. We had these meetings of each a few weeks apart. So each time I was much closer to giving birth. And then once you get past, I think 37 weeks, she's basically on call. And anytime that you need her, if you think you're going into labor, she would be ready. Another thing about this doula that was important to me is she lived quite close to me. If she lived all the way on the west side, it could take her in traffic 2 hours to get from the beach to here. So sometimes there's logistical things. I mean, it was that plus really connecting with her personality that sold me on her. Meanwhile, when I got past 30 weeks, now that it really seemed like I was going to give birth at the hospital where my gynecologist practiced, I knew it was important to do a tour of the maternity ward, which this hospital is really open about that. They do tours often and get all your questions answered. We found out that the times that the hospital gave tours, I actually wasn't able to go because of my work schedule. So the first tour, Luis actually went on without me, which was awesome, and he just recorded as much as he possibly could. So he did that, and then, when I had free time, like over the weekend, we watched his recording together, and it was great. I mean, I was really impressed with, despite it being a hospital, how patient focused they are in terms of like your decisions, what you want, and also the way that the rooms were equipped. They had a birthing ball in the room. There were some beds that had a bar on it that you could hold on to, which to me told me that not all the women there give birth laying on their back, and that they're open to other possibilities. So that to me was really encouraging. And then I just liked the vibe of the maternity ward, and I felt like it was friendly enough atmosphere. And Luis asked a bunch of questions on the tour. One of them was like, can we have control of certain aspects of the room? Can we control the lighting? And the tour guide said, yeah, you can ask for dim lighting. They often wouldn't make promises at the hospital of, oh yes, we definitely can accommodate this for you, but they always seemed open. So even just that openness was encouraging to me, because from what I had heard, a lot of hospitals have a certain hospital policy and they don't want to deviate from that. And that's what I was worried about, was that the nursing staff was closed-minded and they would say, you have to do things our way. We're more experienced than you. You don't know what you're doing. You've never given birth before. And from this tour and from what I was hearing from my gynecologist, they didn't have that close-minded personality at this hospital. So I was happy with the recording of the maternity ward, and at that point I really felt good about being able to give birth in this hospital. And so I was on a job that ended in April. My due date was June 7th. My job ended in April. So after that, I had time to also do the tour for myself and see things in person. So Luis came along again, so it was his second time doing the tour, and I was able to be there in person, ask some follow-up questions. Another thing that we liked about the hospital is you drive right up to a special entrance for the maternity ward. You can leave your car there, super convenient, and you get a parking pass, which they actually gave out early on the tour, so that as soon as you get there to give birth, you already have it and you're ready. So we had that from the tour, and by the time I got to 37, 38 weeks, I had already done multiple of the doula sessions. The third session with the doula was quite close to when I gave birth. I don't remember the exact week, but I was quite pregnant. And so I think we went over again some positions that are helpful in labor. I had a birthing ball at home. So we talked about using the birthing ball while I was in labor, and Luis being there, supporting me. There's like some partner positions that you can do that help contractions. So we went over those, I remember. And I was trying to continue to do yoga as much as I could. Obviously, when you get super pregnant, everything gets hard. I've been there. And so I tried to do certain positions that I still felt comfortable in. I remember there was a Thursday where I felt kind of dull, like what seemed like they might be like pre-contraction, something that would precede contractions at night when I was laying down. I would just feel something. And I remember on that Thursday, I said to Luis that I think the baby would be coming that weekend. And he was like, okay. I could tell that it was like, we'll see. Because since I was due June 7th, a lot of first-time moms will go until after their due date. On Friday, I was still kind of having this dull pain, but there was no like regular contractions. And a bunch of liquid came out onto the floor. And not knowing what it would be like if your water broke, it wasn't that much. It wasn't a dramatic amount of liquid, but I started thinking, what if my water just broke? What if it was more of a trickle instead of a burst? So we started thinking, well, what do? We don't have regular contractions. We think it's possible that maybe my water just broke, but we don't know. So we told our doula. So we texted her that we thought it was possible. And she suggested that we really should go to the hospital and get checked to see if my water indeed did break. And I kind of thought, okay, but that's not what I wanted to do. I didn't want to be at the hospital so early. Like I said earlier, I wanted to labor at home as long as possible before going to the hospital. We waited and we monitored and we noticed I still wasn't having regular contractions. And then the doula called us and she said, listen, if you really think it's possible that your water broke, you need to go get checked. If your water breaks early like that, the longer you wait, the longer the possibility is that you can get an infection. So meanwhile, Luis and I are not really communicating great. It's sort of tense. And we get on our way to the hospital. So we get there and I tell them what's going on at the front desk. And she says, okay, we got to triage you. And so we waited in the waiting room. That's when our doula got there. And Luis likes to say that as soon as she got there, the sort of tension that we were feeling, the worry that we were feeling, like dissipated. So that's another great reason if you're thinking about getting a doula, is like she just like her vibe, her energy when she came in completely changed the room and we felt a lot more relaxed. I went into triage and I told them what was going on. And they said, okay, we'll check you. And I was back there, I was waiting for a while, and they checked me and they go, no, your water is intact, you're not in labor. So I was like, okay. So I go out and I tell Luis and our doula, and I was like, all right, let's go. I'm not in labor yet. So it was like we had this practice run on this Friday night. So we go home and we invite our doula over, and we all had pizza, and it was a nice Friday night, and we just chatted and had a good time and relaxed. She went home and it was like, all right, I'll see you when I'm actually in labor. The next day was a Saturday. And I had more of those like dull, feelings. We get to 1 p.m. on that Saturday and I had a real contraction. It wasn't that strong. 10 minutes later, I had another contraction. 10 minutes later, I had another contraction. So starting at 1 p.m., I started to have these regular contractions. And I learned actually what a contraction is. All throughout that afternoon, I wouldn't say that it was painful. It was just this tensing that I could recognize as a contraction, but it just wasn't that intense. From what I learned from our doula, in early labor like that, just kind of ignore it as much as you can. So we just tried to go about our lives, knowing that I was in early labor and not knowing how long it was going to be until it continued to progress. I also downloaded an app at this time. That was a suggestion from the doula. I will put the name of the app in the description below because I thought it was a really good one. It was very simple. You hit start when your contraction starts and hit stop when it ends. It keeps a record. You can look at a graph of your contractions over time. You can look through and see exactly how far apart your contractions are. So that was super helpful. And so I was going about my life. When a contraction would start, I would hit that start button. And then when it finished, I would hit stop. And that's how we saw throughout the afternoon that the time between was indeed decreasing, going to 9 minutes, going to 8 minutes, going to 7 minutes. And I think I was at the 7/6 minutes apart for quite a while, and I could feel that they were getting more intense. It started to become more like difficult to talk during it, and it started to be more difficult to be the one to like hit start and stop on the app because I was just focused on the contraction. So I started to delegate it to Luis, with my phone. Luis and I went out for a drive, and we were considering, going to the park and getting out and walking around, continuing to try to get labor to progress by walking. And that's when the contractions were getting to a point where I was like, oh, I don't want to be walking around right now because when I have this contraction, I really have to stop and be in one spot. And I don't want to be trying to, walk around a lake when this is happening. I started like squeezing Luis's hand more to get through contractions. So driving around was nice because I could look around at things out the window, but then sort of brace myself when I was in the contraction. Another funny thing was, so at this point, it was like 6 minutes apart. Our doula said that when you're in like early to mid labor, it's a good idea to eat something substantial because you don't know when the next time you're going to eat is. Once labor becomes active and you're much later on, you are not gonna, number one, not gonna want to eat. Number two, might throw up what you eat. So it was maybe around 5, 6 p.m. I, at that time, was really into acai bowls, and that sounded good to me. So we stopped at an acai place near me. I had a strong contraction in the car. And at this point, because we knew they were like 5 minutes apart, I was like, okay, I have like 6 minutes to get in there, get my food, and get out before the next contraction. So as soon as the contraction ended, I went into the store and got my bowl, and I was able to get in and get out between contractions, which was great. And then I ate the acai bowl, and it was good timing to eat that bowl because I was pretty much about to lose that opportunity. I had loaded it up with as much protein as I could, with nuts and seeds and peanut butter, almond butter, whatever, as many calories that I could get on there. So we went home, I ate the whole thing, and continued to labor at home. Luis and I really that day got on the same page, like mentally. When we got home, I remember we made the environment. We drew the blinds, we lit beeswax candles that I had hand poured through my pregnancy, and we put on calming music, and we really made it into a soothing environment for me to continue to labor in, which was another important principle for me. I wanted as much of my labor as possible to be calming, relaxing. I knew that was the way that I was going to progress naturally, was feeling relaxed. And so we had the next few hours, we had a really nice time in this relaxed as possible labor. Luis and I used the positions that our doula had taught us. I got out my yoga mat. I was sitting on the birthing ball sometimes. I would, switch it up as soon as something felt like it wasn't working anymore, wasn't comfortable anymore. Contractions all have a purpose, right? Each contraction, even if it's just 1%, is closer to your baby coming out. Thinking of it that way was something that really made it feel bearable. When I think about and contrast labor pain with like pain from a UTI or from a stomach bug, I actually think of those pains as worse because those are like unpredictable. You don't know when they're going to end. I have memories from like having a stomach bug where I'm like laying on the floor, I'm completely dizzy. My stomach is just like in knots. I feel like I'm going to pass out. To me, that's actually worse. Just that mentality of contractions being for a purpose and it being this, yes, intense tensing, but knowing what it's for completely changes it for me. And also not having like feeling dizzy, feeling like you're going to pass out, feeling a burning like when you have a UTI, that to me is worse. So that's sort of my 2 cents on the experience of labor really being something that you can deal with, you can handle, and that when you are ready to experience them, like all the research that you're doing when you're pregnant, you can get through it. In my yoga practice when I was pregnant, there's an amazing YouTube channel called Pregnancy and Postpartum TV. I loved this channel. Shout out to Jessica who runs that channel because I watched so many of her videos. And one of the things that she did at the end of a yoga practice she had that I watched all the time was called ice meditation. And that is you get a bowl of ice and you stick your hands in the bowl of ice for 1 minute and you focus on breathing through that pain. And she said, if you can do this consistently at the end of your practice for just 1 minute, you're going to be ready to have contractions because it's of course, a different type of pain. You know, your hands are not in ice when you're in labor, but if you can mentally breathe deeply through that, you're going to be ready to feel that. And it really did help me. I really did feel that that prepared me, because these contractions happened. I knew that they had this finite time of being over within a minute. And I had mentally built myself up from that ice meditation. So that was something that I loved. So at this point, we're getting into Saturday night. It is like 8 p.m. and it was really an intimate experience with Luis at this time. We had the candles going, this music. I was leaning on him a lot. I was, squeezing his hand during contractions. That was helpful. We were still going with the app, so I was telling him to hit start. So we had all this data at that point, and I was pretty consistently at 5 minutes between contractions. And we said to each other, I think, let's invite our doula over here. And I'll continue to labor at home, but she'll be here, so she'll be ready, and then we'll all be ready to go to the hospital when we feel that it's time. So we invited her over. I decided to ask her when she was on the way over to pick up some cucumbers and fruits. I thought that sounded nice to try to eat between contractions. And so she picked that stuff up, and she, I think, had been out to dinner at the time. So she gets to our place, I think around 9 o'clock. She brings the fruits and the cucumber, and I start eating it. She fit in great to the environment that we had already built at home. And now I had 2 hands to squeeze for contractions. And then between contractions, we would try to be lighthearted, joke around, just make conversation. Sometimes Luis and her would just make conversations when I was really sort of in my own zone by myself. So that was nice. I didn't feel like I had to entertain them. At this point, contractions were getting quite intense. I couldn't say anything to them when a contraction was happening. I was changing positions a lot. Sometimes I would lie on the couch. Maybe between 9 and 10 p.m., I decided that it would feel nice to get in the shower. And keep in mind, all of my decisions at this point were completely in the moment, asking myself, what would feel good right now? What might be helpful right now? And so I get in the shower, and I had our doula sit right outside the shower, like just sitting on the toilet. I had some contractions in the shower, and I was in there for a while, but the warm water did really feel nice. I get out of the shower, and I forget if it was before or after the shower, but I did vomit up the cucumber and the fruits that she brought over. So I was too late in the game. I couldn't keep it down. And she and Luis were champs about it. Neither of them were squeamish. And so I had already asked beforehand for like a bucket to be nearby. I vomited it all up, and then I felt better. It's like, okay. But the acai bowl that I had had back when I was like 6 minutes apart, that I had kept down. So it was really only after labor was a lot more active and intense that I couldn't keep that food down. Get out of the shower, probably past 10 p.m., and I start to veer into the 4 minutes apart range. I still felt okay at this time not going to the hospital because everything seemed completely normal. It was just that I was progressing, So I was like, as soon as I get to the hospital, I feel like my progression is going to slow because I feel comfortable here. I'm relaxed. I'm in a great positive environment. I don't want to have to go to this place with bright lighting with a bunch of strangers around. And also knowing that the hospital is a 10-minute drive away. We were getting later into the night, and I was like, there's not going to be any traffic when we go. So I still felt good about staying home. Once we got to midnight, I was like squarely in that 4 minute apart zone where it was like each contraction was 4 minutes apart. I feel like we jointly were like, okay, we had our bag packed and everything, but we were like, let's grab our stuff and just be prepared to get out of the door. And so Luis is throwing things into the car. I'm putting on my clothes and just pausing for my intense contractions in between things. So we get in the car. Our doula also had her car, so she gets in her separate car. We drive to the hospital, pull right up to the special maternity entrance. I remember I have a contraction right when we get out of the car. I'm just sort of standing there right outside the car, and they help me in. We tell them what's going on at the front desk. I go into triage. And what was really cool, now it was past midnight, Saturday night, triage was completely empty and it was a calm environment since there was nobody else in there. The triage nurse comes over and, they're getting my information between my contractions. And she says, okay, I'm going to check you. Triage nurse checks me and she says, you're at 4.5. I was surprised because I was already squarely in this 4-minute window. I was like, wow, I can't believe that I'm not more than 4.5. At this point, the doula and Luis come into triage. So I'm in this little triage bay with curtains around. And she says, we're pretty short-staffed on nursing today, so I'm not going to give you your own room upstairs yet. You can continue to labor in triage, basically. I'm like talking to Luis about like, oh, can he read me something? Can he read me an ebook maybe to try to keep my mind off it? So he does that for a little bit, and then, he's chatting with our doula a bit, and I continue to have these contractions. About 1 hour goes by, so now we're like past 1 a.m., and I feel the urge to push. It's very hard to go against that because within my contraction, my body is telling me to push. It's like it felt like it was involuntary. And so I told our doula and Luis that I was feeling the urge to push and that, we had to tell the triage nurse that because I needed to be checked again. So one of them gets up and tells the triage nurse that. She says, okay, I'll check you again. And she comes over to check me again. There's skepticism involved in how much I've progressed in 1 hour, especially being a first-time mom. And so she comes over to check me, but fully not expecting me to have progressed much, you can tell. And she checks me and she immediately says, she's at 9, we have to move. So within 1 hour, I had gone from 4.5 to 9. I also skipped something. A different either doctor or nurse had come over to me within that 1 hour and had gone over. We had our birth plan printed on a piece of paper. And so she'd gone over our birth plan with me verbally and said, okay, we can do this, we can do this. One thing that I'm iffy about is we are really going to recommend Pitocin if you are not progressing quickly. Yeah, I understand that that's very common, but let's see what happens. And of course, I didn't need it because I progressed quickly within that 1 hour. And another point that she paused on was I had written in my birth plan that if things were going well and the baby or me wasn't in distress, that once I'm in the bed, I wanted to try to switch to intermittent heart rate monitoring. There's 2 different styles of heart rate monitoring at the hospital. There's one that is completely constant where they have like a band around your belly. And then there's one that is intermittent where they just check you every once in a while to see what the fetal heart rate is. The one that is usually practiced, like if you're at a birthing center, for example, with a midwife, would be intermittent. So they don't have something. So it's less restrictive. You can get up from the bed easily and move around, walk around. And she said, we probably can't accommodate that tonight because we need the constant monitoring here. And so I knew that would be kind of a big ask at a hospital to get the intermittent monitoring. And so I let go of that one. It was a previous discussion I had also had with my gynecologist where she was like, I can't promise that they'll let you do that. So for me, it wasn't a deal breaker. Now, mind you, they still hadn't given me an actual room. I was still just in triage. And I discovered that my gynecologist, who I really liked, was not on shift. So it was going to be a different doctor. And it was somebody that I hadn't met yet. So I was a little nervous going in there, but I found out that it was a woman. I did really want it to be a woman delivering the baby. And she was this other doctor on shift that I still had not met. Back to that hour that I was describing. Progressed to 9. Triage nurse checks me. She's at 9. We got to move. Pretty much instantly, my bed was on the move. Luis and our doula were tagging along. And suddenly it's like, we got to figure out what room to put her in. This is happening. And so they wheel me up. It's probably getting close to 2 a.m. at this point. I remember hearing like doctor and nurse conversation of like, is she actually at 9? Like, apparently the triage nurse who checked me would have a tendency sometimes to exaggerate the number. So it was like, is she really at 9? And also it's like being a first-time mom. So there was definitely doubt going on still. And we get into the room. Hospital staff is aware that I'm not going to do an epidural. Another side note I have to say is that in my last gynecologist appointment, I was checked for Strep B, which I think is bacterial, something that you can be a carrier of, and it doesn't affect you, but it could affect the baby on the way out. And I was positive for Strep B. So what I was supposed to do as soon as I got to the hospital was I was supposed to tell them that I needed the antibiotic, because the antibiotic needs time to work. And be ready for when the baby comes out so that the baby doesn't contract it. But I was not thinking about that at all. I forgot about it. So, maybe like an hour or more after I had been at the hospital, the triage nurse saw it in my file and says, oh, we have to give you the antibiotic. And I was like, oh yeah, I forgot about that. So she gives it to me. And then I progressed really quickly. So put a pin on that. I'll talk about that more later. We meet the doctor, and my memory from this point is definitely very clouded by the fact that labor was getting so intense, but I could tell, like, I have a lot of like auditory memories from the room, and I could tell that I liked her demeanor. I learned later that she is like very like all about what the patient wants. She was, I think, in her 50s, had been delivering babies for a long time, and was very calm. Keep in mind, it's like 2, 3 a.m. Saturday night. They let us keep dim lighting in the room, and they really honored what we wanted. All of the nurses were young women. I think the only man in the room was like a technician working on machinery in the corner. And I felt supported by the room being full of women, and by the doctor, and there was sort of casual conversation going on in the room with the doula. They were happy to see a doula there, and talking about the profession, and it was just a nice environment while I continued laboring. Our doctor confirmed that I was very much there. I was like at a 9 or past 9. And my next memory basically is starting the sequence of pushing. She said my water was still intact at this time. And at this point, I started basically getting coached on how to push from my side. Our doctor had had experience with women who had done this before. And I was curled up on my left side, sort of right on the edge of the bed. Luis was right at my side, and I sort of had my head buried in his chest. And when a contraction would come, I would go with the contraction and try to push. The contraction would end, and I would recover. So this time, I think it lasted between an hour and a half altogether, where I was pushing, but at first I didn't have the technique down. And I remember the doctor starting to telling me what to adjust. Like, a contraction would end, and she would say, basically, next contraction, like, your whole body has to be actively working toward this push. So when you push from your side, you should really be in a C shape. No part of your body should be working against that. So you shouldn't be arching your back and putting your body in like more of an S position. You should be rounded in and focused on sending everything down, bearing down into the push. And so I remember getting that note and really trying to focus. And Luis and I were really like in this zone. He compares it to boxing. It was like, it really felt like he was in my corner of the ring, and we had this time between contractions to sort of like, he would coach me on what was happening. And at this point, I was not, even between contractions, I was not really talking. I was just sort of mentally gathering all the strength that I had. I imagined the strength of all of the women. I'm going to get emotional talking about this now. I imagined the strength of all of the women who have given birth before me, and I asked them for their help. And so I was coaching myself, and he was coaching me too. He's saying, all right, okay, next one, you're gonna, and so I was really listening to him. I remember there were certain times between contractions when I also like couldn't focus mentally, and I was relying on what he was telling me, what he was coaching me. Our doula was standing next to him, and one of the things that we adjusted during this period while I was pushing was she could hold my leg up since I was on my side. I'm trying to spend all my energy getting my body in this position to push correctly anatomically, or ergonomically, I should say. And so even just holding my own leg up was taking away from that. I could let her hold the weight of my leg while I focused on the shape my body was in and trying to get the baby down. I also, in my mind, was having conversations with my baby, saying we're going to work together. That was one thing. When going back at the time when I progressed between 4.5 to 9 in that hour, I was having mental conversations with the baby, saying we have to progress, we have to continue, we have to work together. We're not going to stall. We're going to continue working together. We're progressing. I had been pushing for a certain amount of time, and I remember our doctor checking me again and saying the only thing left that's holding her in is your bag of waters. That's it. Once she's free of that, she's going to come out, which is great. It's funny because it was the exact opposite of what I had thought the day before when I thought my water broke early. No, it was actually, that was the last thing remaining, which can be a great situation to be in because there's no chance for infection to come in when your waters are intact to the very end. Still in this zone, talking to myself, getting coaching, and there was a period of time when I was pushing, and apparently the top of her head was visible, but I wasn't pushing hard enough, and the contraction would end, and her head would disappear and go back up. Now, the thing to know about that is when that happens, as soon as you're in the next contraction and you start pushing, you go right back to that same position, so her head would become visible again. It's not like you undo the progress that you had between contractions. You start and you're right back to where you were. So that was encouraging to me because I was getting scared that between contractions, if it appeared that she was going back up, that I would have to redo that same effort. And the doctor was like, no, you're already there. Like each time though, you need to really, she goes, 3 pushes per contraction. And I remember thinking, oh God, 3, that seems like so much, And Luis is there like, you can do it, you got it. After I heard that I needed 3 solid pushes, a contraction would come. I would really just focus as much as I could on the pushes being as intense as I could and getting 3 solid ones in. And I remember like yelling during these contractions, like hearing the sounds that I was making and like being surprised at the sounds I was making because it was just coming out. And at a point I was told to reach down and feel the top of her head, which I realized after was helpful in the sense of like, if you can feel the progress that you've made, it can really encourage you for your next round of pushing. But at first, when she said that, I said, no, I don't want to yet, because I wanted to just get her out. And I don't know, it was like, it seemed like frightening to me or something. But the first time that they said that, I declined. I said, no, I don't want to yet. And I was told that she had a lot of hair on her head. They were like telling me things about her before she was even out. And then like a couple of rounds later, they told me again, they said, reach down and feel the top of her head. And so I finally gave in. I said, okay. And I felt it. And I was so shocked because she had so much hair on the top of her head. It was like, it just felt like matted hair that I could feel. And I said, that makes no sense. Because I was expecting to feel like a bald head, and that's not what I felt at all. I felt like a ton of hair. A few more rounds go by that were just, I just put everything that I had into it, you know, mentally, physically, you know, everything I possibly could muster. And those last couple pushes, I felt burning, and that really scared me because I was like, oh, I must have torn, you know. And the doctor was really encouraging. She said, no, don't worry. She's just stretching you out. It's okay. And pretty much right after that burning that I felt, she finished coming out, and I was surprised. I was like, oh God, I don't have to push anymore. And they said, no, she's out. And they immediately put her on my chest, and I saw her face. It's obviously a really emotional moment at that time. And I remember feeling so relieved. I'm back the next day just to finish the story real quick. So she came out, there was a big digital clock on the wall, and she was born exactly at 4 a.m. And I didn't have any tearing that required stitches. So it was just normal healing, no stitches. And you know, I really feel like it's because I was able to push from my side the entire time. The other thing that happened after is, if you remember, I mentioned that I remembered late that I had to get the Strep B antibiotic. Well, it's supposed to work for 3 hours before the baby is born, and there literally was not 3 hours between when I took it and when she was born. So they wanted us to stay at the hospital a little longer to monitor her and make sure that she didn't have any symptoms from the Strep B, and everything was fine. So usually you would stay 24 hours at the hospital. We stayed about 36, just to make sure that everything was good with her, and it was. And that's the story. If you watched this whole thing, I'm guessing it's because you're interested in a natural birth, no epidural, no drugs, and I'm here to tell you, you can do it. Just do your prep. Try to prep physically with yoga and the ice meditation, and then try to do some mental prep. For me, the mentality was a big part of the game, and I was ready. I knew that this was my goal from the beginning. I was ready for it, and you can handle the contractions. You can do it. Like I said, I wouldn't even call it the worst pain that I've been through, because every contraction is for a purpose, and it gets you closer to holding your baby. You are stronger than you think, and not only is it possible, but you can do it. That's all I got. Take care.